Montana Territory, early October, 1877. The wind howled over the plains, dry and sharp. When he first saw her barefoot and stumbling, collapsing like dropped laundry onto the wooden boards of his front porch, Silas Boone stood still in the doorway, one hand on the frame, a rifle slung over his shoulder from checking his western fence line. For a second, he thought she might be dead. Then the bundle beside her shifted and let out the soft, whimpering cry of a child. He dropped the rifle and moved fast. The woman was young, barely more than 20, maybe less, with dirt streaking her face, lips cracked. Her dress was torn at the hem and clung to her like damp paper. She had a toddler curled into her side, maybe 2 years old, and a baby wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. Both children were too quiet. Silas swept the baby into his arms first, then the toddler. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he bent to lift her. "Please," she rasped. "Do not leave them." "I will not," he said. His voice was steady, calm. "You are safe now." Inside, the cabin was plain but warm. He laid her on his cot, stoked the stove, and poured hot water into a tin basin. The toddler, a girl with tangled dark curls and wide, wary eyes, clung to his leg while he cleaned her mother's face. The baby, no more than a few months old, had a fever, but Silas had stored willow bark and knew how to make tea strong enough to bring it down. It took 3 days before she could sit upright again. On the 4th morning, she finally spoke with clarity. "My name is Elira Kess." Her voice cracked, but she held her chin high. "My husband died in Kansas. He owed men money. When I could not pay, they came for us. I ran." She looked at her children, her hands trembling as they smoothed the toddler's hair. "This is Faye. The baby is Fern." Silas nodded. "You made it far." "I walked for days. I thought we would die out there." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. "But I saw your smoke, and I hoped someone kind lived here." He did not know what to say to that. So he stood, poured her another cup of warm tea, and left her to rest. Silas was not a man used to company. He had lived alone since the war ended, kept his land quiet and his days ordered. But now there were small shoes by the hearth, and the sound of a baby's soft breathing at night, and the shape of a woman moving through his kitchen, careful and grateful, but not meek. Elira had strength under her gentleness, like a pine that holds fast through snow. By the 2nd week, she was helping with chores. She refused to be idle. She washed the linens, boiled water for bath days, and even helped muck the small barn. Faye followed him everywhere now, her little boots trailing behind him in the dirt. She called him Mr. Silas and held his hand without asking. He found he did not mind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Silas sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Elira stepped out, Fern bundled against her chest. "You saved us," she said softly. He looked at her, the way the light caught in her hair, the quiet strength in her eyes. "You saved yourself. I just opened a door." She smiled then, the first real smile he had seen from her. "Still, thank you." He nodded, but something shifted in his chest, a warmth he had not felt in years. Later that night, after the children were asleep, she found him by the fire, still awake, staring into the flames. "You do not talk much," she said, sitting beside him. "I talk when there is something worth saying." "And is there?" He glanced at her. Her shoulder brushed his. She smelled like soap and lavender, like a home he had never dared imagine for himself. "You are stronger than any woman I have ever met," he said. "And I have known a few." Elira looked into the fire, her voice low. "I have not felt strong in a long time. You are now." She turned her face toward him, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. That night, when she stood from the fire and whispered good night, she paused. "I feel safe here," she said. "You are," he answered, and she believed him. The next morning, she was in the garden with the girls when he rode out to check the trapline. When he returned, she was laughing full-throated and real as Faye chased a chicken in crooked circles. Silas stood watching from a distance, something in his chest pulling tight and tender all at once. He had taken them in because it was the right thing to do. But now, looking at her in his yard, sunlight in her hair, her baby in her arms, he wondered if there was more to it than that. He was not a man who dreamed of love. But maybe, just maybe, it had found him anyway. By the time the first frost glazed the tops of the fence posts, the cabin had settled into a rhythm that felt less like guests and more like a household. The girls rose with the light, Fern reaching out from her cradle with one tiny fist, Faye already padding toward the stove before the fire was even lit, her little hands eager to help. Elira dressed in the quiet, her movements smooth and practiced, and Silas had begun to notice the way she folded her sleeves precisely at the forearm before lifting the kettle, or how she pressed her hand once to the doorframe after stepping outside, as if measuring the day. That morning, a thin layer of snow clung to the sagebrush beyond the gate. Silas hitched the mare to the wagon while Elira bundled the girls. She tied Fern close to her chest with a wool shawl, and Faye, wrapped in a two large coats Silas had unearthed from the loft, clambered up beside him on the bench. Elira climbed up last, settling beside him with a glance toward the pale sky. "It's a long road?" she asked. He nodded, tightening the reins. 22 miles to the trading post. Should be back before nightfall if the snow holds. They rode in silence for a while, the creak of the wagon wheels steady beneath them. Faye dozed against his arm, her breath warm where it touched the fabric of his coat. Elira watched the road ahead, her eyes moving over the hills with a quiet alertness. "Did you ever think of leaving?" she asked after a time. "This place, I did," he said. "After the war. Thought I'd head west to Oregon. But the land here was cheap. I had the strength to build and not much else. So I stayed." She didn't speak for a moment. Then, "I never thought I'd be west of Missouri. My people were from Tennessee. Dirt farmers. I was raised to believe the edge of the world ended at the Mississippi." He glanced at her. "It doesn't, but it changes you crossing it." She met his eyes. It did. The post was a long, low building with a sagging roof and a crooked porch. A half-dozen wagons stood outside, and a black dog wandered the yard, sniffing at boot heels. Inside, the air smelled of salt pork and dust. Elira held Fern close as they moved through the narrow aisles, picking out flour, beans, and a coil of new rope. A woman behind the counter, older, with a face lined deep from wind and time, narrowed her eyes when she saw Elira. "She yours?" the woman asked, nodding at Fern. "Yes," Elira said simply. "And the other?" Her chin lifted just enough to make it clear she'd noticed the tone. "Also mine." The woman's eyes flicked to Silas. "He yours too?" Elira didn't answer at first. Then, steady as snowfall, she said, "He's the reason we're standing here instead of buried out past the ridge." The woman looked down, muttered something about the weather, and turned to weigh the beans. Outside, Elira stood beside the wagon, watching the sky darken with the thick promise of more snow. Silas adjusted the sacks in the back, his hands moving with practiced care. "You didn't owe me that," she said. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to, but I've spent enough years being spoken of like I'm something to be explained." He looked at her then, the way her jaw stayed set even as her eyes softened. "You don't need explaining, Elira." Her breath caught, just for a moment. She turned toward the wagon, but her hand brushed his coat sleeve as she passed. It lingered there, a second longer than it might have had she not meant it. They rode home with the clouds pressing low. Faye slept again, curled against the grain sacks, and Fern fussed only once before dozing in Elira's arms. The wind had picked up by the time they reached the cabin, and Silas had to lean his shoulder into the barn door to push it open. Elira carried the girls inside while he stabled the mare. When he returned, she was already sweeping the hearth, the smell of boiling beans rising from the pot. She didn't look up when he entered, but she said, "Thank you for letting me come." "You live here," he said. She stopped, turned to face him. "That's the first time you've said it that way." Silas took a slow breath. The fire crackled behind her, casting light along her cheekbone. "It's the first time it's felt true." Her eyes didn't leave his. "It does to me, too." He stepped forward just once, and she didn't step back. The rest of the night passed quiet, the way good nights should. Faye curled beneath a quilt pieced from old shirts. Fern settled with only the smallest sigh. Elira sat by the fire, sewing a new hem into a dress someone else had outgrown, and Silas watched the flames beside her, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full. The first real snow came before the month was out, heavy and wet, blanketing the hills and settling thick in the trees beyond the pasture. It muted every sound, even the creak of the cabin door as Silas stepped out at dawn, shovel in hand. The stillness didn't bother him. It never had. But now, with 3 people asleep inside, he found himself listening for the faintest stir, a reminder he wasn't alone in the world anymore. By midday, Elira was kneading bread near the stove, sleeves rolled high, her hands moving with quiet confidence. Fern slept in a basket by the hearth, and Faye sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, carving notches into a stick with one of Silas's duller knives. The silence between them had changed. Not gone, but warmer now like steam off a kettle. He watched her hands. "You done this much before?" "I used to sell loaves in a mining camp near Atchison," she said, not looking up. "They paid in copper, mostly. Sometimes flour." "You were alone then?" She glanced at him. "No. My husband was with me, but he didn't stay long once the money dried up." He didn't press. The dough thudded softly as she turned it out. "What about you?" she asked after a moment. "You ever think about marrying?" He took longer to answer than he meant to. "Thought about it some, but I didn't have anything to offer." Elira turned her face toward him. "You built this place with your own hands. You kept us warm through the first cold. You gave my girls a roof and a bed and peace enough to sleep through the night. If that's not something, I don't know what is." The air between them held still. Then Faye stood and said, "Mama, can I help?" And the moment passed like a gust through tall grass. That evening, Silas brought in an old rocking chair from the barn loft. The seat sagged a little, but Elira's eyes warmed when he set it near the fire. "I used to rock Fern every night," she said, her voice low. "Back when we were still in Lawrence. Before everything fell apart." He nodded. "Then you should have it." She reached out, touched the arm of the chair, and didn't speak again for a long time. The next morning, the roof groaned under new weight. Silas climbed up with a broom and scraped the snow clear while Elira tacked blankets along the windows to keep the cold from creeping in. Faye helped by wrapping rags around the door seams, her breath puffing in little clouds. When the chores were done, Elira took out a length of calico and began sewing a new dress for Faye, who had grown out of her sleeves. "You work fast," Silas said, watching the needle flash. "I had to," she replied. "When we ran, I couldn't carry much. I had to make do with what I could find." His brow furrowed. "You ever think about going back?" "No," she didn't hesitate. "There's nothing waiting there but debts and dust. Here I can breathe." Outside, the wind picked up again, blowing dry snow across the windows. Silas stood, took another log from the stack, and fed it to the fire. "You're not just breathing here, Elira. You're living again." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, he saw the way her shoulders settled, like something unspoken had eased. Later that night, after the girls were asleep and the wind had died down, Elira stood by the window, arms folded. The stars were sharp and clear, the sky black as ink. "I used to dream about a place like this," she said. "Not the cold, maybe, but the quiet, the steadiness." He stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers on the sill. She didn't move away. "You've built something here," she said. "Not just the cabin. You made it safe." "I built it so I wouldn't have to run anymore," he said. "Didn't expect anyone would ever share it." She turned toward him. "You might not have asked, but I stayed anyway." He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and touched her hand, rough fingertips meeting her softer ones. She let them stay there, and in the hush of that night, with the fire low and the stars still high, nothing needed to be said. Not yet. Not with everything already unfolding between them, quiet as falling snow. The late sun had a copper edge to it, slipping low behind the cottonwoods as Silas hitched the gate closed with one hand and rubbed his shoulder with the other. The cold had settled deep this year, earlier than usual, and he could feel it in the joints that still remembered Appomattox. Elira was kneeling by the woodpile, stacking kindling into a canvas sling. Her braid had come loose at the nape, strands catching firelight as she turned her head. "Leave that," Silas said as he crossed the yard. "I'll see to the rest." Her eyes lifted, steady. "You've already split enough for tomorrow. I want to get ahead. You've done enough today." She wiped her palms on her skirt but didn't stand. There's comfort in doing. That was new. She usually kept her thoughts tucked away like letters in a drawer. He crouched beside her, not touching, just letting the silence come down slow between them. "I didn't know how to be still before all this," she said, voice softened by the dusk. "I thought movement meant safety, that if I just kept going, I'd outpace whatever waited behind." Silas didn't speak. He let her words settle. "But this place," she went on, "it holds stillness in a way that doesn't feel like danger. Feels like waiting for something good." He picked up a piece of kindling, tapped it once against his boothiel. "You ever think you'd want to stay for good?" She looked at him then, and the quiet between them changed shape again. "I don't know if I deserve to want that," she said. "Maybe not," he said. "But you do anyway." The next morning, snow fell again, not heavy, but steady, the kind that blanketed the world slow and silent. Silas saddled the mule to haul in sacks of oats from the far shed, and Elira bundled the girls for the short walk to the henhouse. When she came back in, cheeks flushed and wind-bitten, she carried 2 eggs in her apron and a soft, cautious smile. "Faye wants to name the red hen after the mule," she said, brushing snow from her hem. "That's an insult to the mule," he answered, and Elira laughed. A sound he hadn't heard from her in that shape before, unguarded, unafraid. Later, while the girls napped, she joined him in the barn. She leaned against the wall as he hammered a rusted hinge back into place on the stall door. Her eyes moved across the beams above like they were tracing the lines of the past. "I used to think barns were just for work," she said. "But there's something about the quiet here. It's like the walls remember things." He didn't pause his work. "They do." She stepped closer, boots crunching over hay. "What do yours remember?" Silas looked up from the hinge. "A boy who didn't know how to build anything. A man who learned by doing." She touched the edge of the stall door, fingertips grazing the smoothed wood. "You've made a place where people can breathe, Silas. That's not small." His chest tightened in a way he wasn't used to. "You've made it more than I ever could have." That night, Elira stood at the hearth while he read from an old ledger book, not for its worth but for the rhythm of the words. Ferns stirred in her cradle, and Faye whispered something in her sleep. Elira turned from the fire and knelt beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You've been their steadiness," she said. "But I want to be yours too, if you'll let me." He closed the book. "You already are." She leaned in then, and her forehead rested against his. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just the closeness of two people who knew what it was to lose too much and still choose to reach for something warm. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the fire held. The wind shifted east in the second week of December, carrying with it a brittle cold that settled into the bones. Silas felt it strongest in the early hours, when he rose before light to tend the animals, his breath visible in the dimness of the barn. Elira would wake not long after, her footsteps soft in the cabin as she moved through morning tasks. The quiet they shared each day had changed, filled now with a closeness that needed no naming. One afternoon, as the sky turned pale with frost, Silas returned from checking the boundary fence along the creek, his gloves stiff with ice. He found Elira at the table, sewing a thick lining into the sleeves of one of his shirts. Faye was helping by sorting buttons into neat rows, her tongue caught in concentration between her teeth. "I thought I'd take the girls to the hollow past the ridge tomorrow," Elira said without looking up. "There's still some rosehips clinging to the brush. Might be enough for syrup." Silas unfastened his coat. "The trail's narrow that way. You'd need the sled." "I can take it." She tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. "If you think the pony'll pull steady, she'll do fine if she's not rushed. I'll hitch it for you in the morning." Her eyes met his then, quiet gratitude flickering in their depths. "Would you come with us?" "I was planning to." He crossed the room, knelt to stoke the stove. "It's better with more hands." The next day dawned pale and still. They left just after breakfast, Fern tucked into a padded basket between Elira's knees, Faye wrapped in wool and pressed close. The sled creaked lightly over the packed snow, the pony stepping slow and sure. Sunlight filtered through the bare scrub oaks, casting long shadows across the drifted trail. The hollow lay in a dip between two low hills, sheltered from wind. They gathered in silence, gloved fingers brushing against frost-brittle stems. Faye found a patch of red berries still clinging to the vine and held them out to Elira like treasure. Silas watched as Elira knelt beside her, their heads bent close, the baby dozing peacefully in the basket beside them. On the ride back, Elira leaned into him without words, her shoulder against his. The warmth of her presence seeped through the wool of his coat, and something eased in his chest, quiet and sure. That evening, after the girls had been tucked in and the syrup set to boil, Elira stood facing the window, arms folded across her middle. Snow drifted against the panes, soft and slow. "I've been thinking about spring," she said. Silas set down the tin cup he'd been holding. "What about it?" "I want to plant a garden." He nodded once. "We'll clear the north patch. Good sun there. And I want to raise hens. More than the few we have. I can build a better coop." She turned then, her face unreadable in the firelight. "I want to stay, not just for the season. I want to belong here." Silas stood, but didn't move closer. "You already do. I mean truly," she said, her voice steady. "Not as a guest. Not just because you took us in. I want to make this place mine, too. I want to wake up here 10 years from now, with you beside me. I want to watch Faye run through the pasture and Fern learn to speak in sentences. I want to be part of what this becomes." He stepped toward her without hesitation, his hand reaching for hers. "Then marry me, Elira." She didn't flinch. "You sure?" "I've never been surer of anything." Her fingers curled into his. "Then yes, I will." They married in January, in the small clapboard church 2 miles east, after the road had cleared enough for the sled to pass easily. The preacher's wife made a wreath of dried winter sage, and Faye carried a scrap of white ribbon tied around a bundle of pine cones. There were no guests but the girls, no music but the creak of the timbers above and the soft hush of snow falling outside. Elira wore a dress she had sewn herself. Silas wore his best shirt, the one she had lined with flannel. When the words were spoken and the vows made simple and unadorned, she leaned into him without hesitation, and he wrapped his arms around her like he meant never to let go. Afterward, they returned to the cabin, and the girls fell asleep curled beneath a quilt while the fire burned low. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat by the stove, hands joined. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, her voice soft in the hush of night. "A home that doesn't come with fear." Silas looked at her, the woman who had walked across a half-dead land to find safety, and now sat beside him with her heart open as spring. "And I never thought someone would want to share what I built." She smiled and leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We built it now." And they did. In the spring, they planted potatoes and beans, and Faye helped carry water from the well in a tin pail that clanked with every step. Fern took her first steps near the barn, wobbling toward a patch of clover under Elira's watchful eye. Silas built a coop with his own hands, and Elira painted the door pale blue. By summer, the garden bloomed, and the hens laid regular. Faye had a swing fastened to the oak tree out back, and Fern's curls turned sun-golden. They never spoke of the road that brought them there, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need to be spoken to be remembered. It lived in how they held each other each night, in the way Elira traced the grain of the wooden table Silas had made, in the way he kissed her temple before heading to the fields. They grew old there, slow and content. The land held them steady, and in each day's work, they found something more than survival. They found peace. They found love. And they kept it, steady as the seasons, for all their days.